I, Barbarian. 1. Rumble at the last drop-in. The sun was not long risen over the sore-edged mountains of the east, its golden rays glistening the forest dew. Fall had come early in these lands, and the mornings were cool with chill winds rustling through the falling leaves. The barbarian stood tall on his umber beast, the horns on his helm, making the giant man look even bigger as he rode proudly down the earthy path. He wore 2 wolf pelts, the heads covering his shoulders and biting into his chainmail shirt. He roamed through the civilized lands of Galmora, a realm accursed and torn by civil strife, harried by invasions, racked by religious war, and rotted through by the greed of lords and commoners alike. The barbarian observed the fairly large village before him, nestled along a river. A windmill, a temple, and a watchtower loomed above the clustered roofs and surrounding farmlands. At the edge of the village stood a crude grave marker, a wooden placard pierced by a dagger that pinned a ribboned lock of wilted hair. Beneath it were scratched the scribbles of civilized men that the barbarian could not read. "What does that say?" the barbarian asked a passing villager. "It says, 'Here lies Barbarian,'" said the villager. The barbarian raised an eyebrow. The villager explained. A former man-o'-war that was hired to guard this village. He was wooed by a village tramp. One night of heavy drinking and ample loving, she plunged that dagger there through his heart while he slept. She then brought her other lover in, someone she fancied more, the leader of the Sinner's Sons' man-o'-wars, savage men from Zorathir, to rule the town. That's a braid of her hair there. See, a reminder of who rules Eftherodor. The Sinner's Sons? "Nay," said the villager, "the wicked smile that put them there." Upon entering the settlement, the barbarian felt the cold glare of eyes, as all within the village stopped their errands and went silent to observe the coming stranger. Wanting to stay clear of civilization, to be closer to the gods, the barbarian had kept clear of any settlements and people. Alas, the gods refused to speak to him, so enough of that for now. An old vintage wine and a firm bosomed wench of a somewhat more recent vintage sounded like a much better idea. He ignored the treacherous gazes and sought a tavern. 2 men with spears observed him malignantly as he rode past, one spitting on the ground, perhaps relaying a message to the giant warrior about local hospitality. The barbarian ignored him. After tying up his horse outside what he took to be an inn, the giant warrior made for the entrance, noticing the 2 spearmen following to join him. Above the door was a sign with a man hanging from a rope. Unable to read the scribbles under the picture, the barbarian shrugged and passed through the doors. The inn's rustic hall rose 2 stories beneath a smoke-darkened roof. A broad hearth cast warm light across 5 scarred wooden tables, their surfaces burnished by years of hard use. The place was nearly empty, save for the innkeeper behind the bar, and across the room, a beardless Kalkadjir of the stout dwarven race, tending a meal over the open flames. 4 burly men, likely man-o'-wars, sat with a female companion, a pretty thing in fine garments, while a bar wench lingered nearby. All of them watched the barbarian as he strode purposefully to the bar, their gazes clinging to him even as he ignored them. He drew a few coppers from his pouch, set them on the bar top, and said, "A jug of wine and some mutton." The innkeeper stared at him with curiosity, and said, "My apologies, sir, but here, at the last drop, we currently only have mead and ale." The barbarian grunted. "Then get me some ale, then, innkeeper." The innkeeper nodded and did as he was bid. "Here you go, traveller." A jug of ale stood before the stranger. "As for the mutton, today we have stew. Fidoki the dwarfman over there is preparing it." The Kalkajir turned from his pot and gave an ugly wink. "That will do," said the barbarian, taking a swig of his ale. He wiped the foam from his dark beard with the back of his hand, then watched as the dwarf filled a bowl with stew and waddled over to set it before him. "Here you are, master," the Kalkajir said, grinning with a gap of missing teeth as he set the meal before the giant. He was smaller and leaner than most of the Kalkajir the barbarian had met in his wanderings, and he moved with a limp, one leg twisted from some old hurt. The barbarian nodded in approval of the crippled Kalkajir, and took a spoonful of hot stew, and inserted it in his mouth, too hungry to worry about burning his tongue. Across the room, the man-o'-wars, who seemed to have been busy teasing the girl until his arrival, now turned their full attention to him. They watched the giant man go back and forth from his ale to his stew with unwelcoming eyes. Finally, the biggest one with the thickest beard and shaggy hair opened his big-lipped mouth and said, "Flea-bitten savages don't usually stop in Pterodor." The barbarian stopped chewing on his stew and looked up at the man-o'-war through his drooping hair. Giving the civilized man a look of annoyance, he took another swig of ale and turned back to his stew. Annoyed at being ignored, the man-o'-war continued, "Not a place that your ilk would last." This time, the two spearmen that had followed the barbarian into the inn, each came over and flanked him. "I just need a moment to finish my stew," said the barbarian, and got back to chewing on a zesty morsel. "Not in here, you won't, savage," said one of the flanking spearmen. The barbarian lifted the last spoonful of stew, his scarred face knitting into a frown. Then, with the suddenness of a stalking panther, he brought the bowl crashing down on the spearman's skull. Hot stew burned across the man's face, while the bowl broke the man's nose in the process. The spearman instantly fell over screaming curses as he clawed at his burning flesh. Before his companion could react, he received the barbarian's hammer of a fist to the jaw, which instantly snapped. Darkness covered the man's eyes before he hit the ground. The man-o'-wars were quick to their feet with steel in hand, ready to put an end to this upstart. In response, the barbarian brandished a giant axe and swung it down at the screaming spearman with the burning face, permanently shutting him up. Right then, the barbarian grinned at his opponents. "Who would like to die next?" Reveus walked down the main road towards the commotion. Commotion had been a common thing in the village of Pterodor recently, especially since they had hired the hairy-faced man-o'-war, Drould, and his sinners' sons to guard the village from the Murgor band that had been pillaging through the forest this last season. They had bullied the village into submission, drinking and womanizing, even violating one of the boys. But Reveus preferred drunken man-o'-wars, even at their extortionate costs, than the brutal slaughter that came from the Murgors. So far they had skirmished once with the Murgor band, and kept them at bay. A small crowd of villagers had gathered outside the last drop-in, none daring to go inside to see what the fuss was about. Rivius could hear clashing steel and men screaming from inside, followed by heavy steps and the breaking and shuffling of furniture. Finally the door burst open, and there was a great consternation amongst the crowd as Druld the Man-o'-War stumbled out of the inn, his face in pain and anguish, his hands clinging to his drooping guts. Like a giant shadow from one of the hells, a gore-drenched man appeared behind him, holding a giant axe. With a massive hand, he grabbed Druld by the hair and pulled his head up. One swing of his axe cut into the Man-o'-War's neck, but failed to decapitate him. Cursing in a savage language that neither Rivius or anybody else could understand, the giant man gave his axe another swing, and this time the blade cut clean through, releasing the Man-o'-War's head from his shoulders. There were gasps of horror as the giant man lifted the leader of the sinner's son's head and presented it to the crowd. When he was finished showing off his trophy, he tossed it at the villagers and retired back into the inn. Rivius knew the villagers were cowards, too afraid to enter the inn with such a beast inside. Yet he also recognized his own cowardice, and that of the others was masked by morbid curiosity, a desire to catch a glimpse of the stranger that kept them lingering and hesitant to flee. For all the horror of the spectacle, Rivius had other concerns. He breathed a quiet sigh of relief, for he had owed Druld a heavy purse of coin, just as he had once owed it to the former guardian of Fertirodor, the barbarian hired to protect the village before him. Both debts had been settled with their deaths. He had no eagerness to protest. Finally the doors burst open again, and the barbarian came out with a jug of ale in one hand, while his giant axe hung from his back. Vrina, Druld's lover, burst out of the door and went running after him, cursing him and striking him with her hands. "You bastard!" she cried out. "You killed Druld! You killed him! You barbarian swine!" Rivius watched as Vrena, braver than any of the villagers, and usually far more cunning, leapt onto the giant's back and began pummeling him with her small fists. With one hand, the barbarian seized her by the hair and flung her to the ground. "Away with you, wench," said the giant man, and kept walking. Unrelenting, and with a vicious scowl, Vrena was back on her feet and reached for the stranger's dagger. The barbarian would have none of it. He grabbed her by the hand and squeezed, forcing her to release the weapon, and then dragged her along. "Help me! Help me!" she cried, but Rivius knew that all the villagers were too cowardly to react against such an imposing human. Pausing outside the stables, the giant man smirked and entered the structure, dragging the girl in with him, kicking and screaming. 2. The Bargain. Rivius headed to the river, where he was told the barbarian was bathing. With him, he brought a bottle of ale as an offering to the giant. The barbarian wasn't difficult to find, his massive form heaving out of the cold water, corded muscles tight around his hefty frame. With him was Fidoki, the Kalkadjer, bringing the giant man's skins to dry himself as his form emerged from the water. Rivius noticed that the barbarian's beard was now gone, and all that was left was a well-groomed moustache. Definitely Fidoki's fine work, no doubt. "Greetings, warrior." Rivius gathered the courage to speak. He continued, "Ahem. Greetings, warrior. My name is Rivius, the village elder. Not because I am old, you see. Our original elder died, and so we appointed a new elder in his stead, and the good people of Etherodor chose me. I have brought you ale." Revius remembered the plot with Vrena and the sinner's sons to make the elder disappear. The villagers accepted that he died of old age, but Revius knew differently. The barbarian looked at him curiously and said, "Take a sip." "From my ale?" "Yes." "Very well." Revius wrenched out the cork and took 2 mighty swigs of ale in an attempt to impress the giant stranger. After wiping the remnants of the drink from his mouth with his sleeve, he said, "See, friend, no poison here." With a grunt, the barbarian stepped forward and snatched the ale from Revius's hands. Taking a few mighty gulps, he felt refreshed and said, "Thank you, Revius." "We held council, see," Revius continued. "We discussed important matters that concern yourself." The barbarian raised an eyebrow. Revius continued, "You must be new to Galmora. When Gundar fell, order fell with it. Petty lords turned on one another, and our own lord was slain, as was the guardian hired to replace him. In the end, we were left to bargain with the ruffians you met at the last drop-in, paying them to guard what little we had left." The barbarian stared at Revius statue-like. Revius kept speaking. "The surrounding settlements have come under a recent threat from a Murgor band that is going from village to village, burning them down and stealing their women. Do you know what they do with their women?" "They breed with them," said the barbarian. "Their mutts eat their way out of the woman's womb. A terrible ending I wouldn't wish on any girl. I am familiar with these monsters, Revius. I have collected plenty of their skulls in my youth. What do you want from me?" "To grant you lordship of this village, as its protector." "Why would I want to stay in this bumpkin hovel?" The barbarian was clearly getting annoyed. "Because we will pay you," said Revius, smiling stupidly. "With what? You have nothing here that I seek." "We have ale, and food, and skins, and women. You can have whatever you want, and you won't hear a complaint. Free of charge, all of it. We are all at your service." Looking desperate, he added, "We can also pay you with coppers, all we can muster. All you have to do is protect us from the coming threat." "And why don't you protect yourselves?" The barbarian took another swig from Revius's ale and passed the bottle to his Kalkajur companion. "We are mere peasants, sir. We don't know how to fight. The only fighters we had were the ones you dispatched. There is no lord that protects these lands, so everyone has turned to manor wars. We will be helpless when the Murgors come." The barbarian rubbed the freshly shaved skin on his face. "Anything I want, eh?" "Within good reason, of course." "Of course. What do you think of all this, Fidoke?" "I think you should take the offer, master." "All right, then. I'll take your offer. But first, The barbarian's words were caught short from a bolt that sped by him, taking some blood with it as it grazed his shoulder. "Devil's crooked horns!" the barbarian cursed. "Bastard!" a female voice cried out from the foliage. The trio looked over to see Vrena, crossbow in hand, running away. "Vrena, no!" Revius cried out, ducking reflexively in case she fired again. Watching the girl disappear into the village, the Kalkajir jested. "I think she misses you, master." The barbarian looked at the bleeding scratch. He was in awe at the thought that he had almost died at the hands of a feeble girl that he had violated. He looked down at Fidoki and said, "Indeed." And so the days passed quickly for the barbarian in Fetherodor. The villagers fulfilled all his desires, grudgingly if they had to. As he passed his time with hard drink and sweet female flesh, irritable voices eventually began to murmur. 3. A meeting of fools. "He is sucking us dry," complained Fatas, his fists clenched and his moustache curled. "How much more do we have to take? And then he demands our wealth in coppers on top of all this." "I say we kill him in his sleep," spoke Bergam, as he picked away at his chair with a dagger. "Vrena pulled that off pretty well with the previous barbarian. Enough is enough already." "And then what?" broke in Reveus. "Do you mean to fight the Murgor band yourself? Better to put up with his antics for now than to have to face a terrible death later." "He has done nothing to prepare the defences of the village," said Arkaf the blacksmith. "All he does is drink and wench himself at our expense." "He is currently at the last drop in, drinking Elmul's barrels dry," Forhythe said. "He has taken 2 other girls after Vrena, these ones being willing, mind you. They drink with him and serve him all day. Therodor has turned into his little paradise." "Time to put an end to this," declared Fathas. Vrena then spoke with venom on her tongue. "And where were all you brave men when he ravaged me in the stables? All brave words now, but cowering like mice when he took me against my will." "Against your will? I heard that you liked it," Begram mocked the angry girl. "Vrena would have none of it. Within half a moment she was on top of him with dagger in hand. 'Dog spawned of a dog!' she cursed as she made to plunge the blade into Begram's heart. She cut flesh but was incapable of completing her dark deed, 6 hands quickly on her, pulling her away from her wretched prey. 'Insolent swine! I will have your head, you scum!' She twisted and toiled as more hands struggled to restrain her. "What is going on here?" asked an alien voice, heavily accented, that had not been part of the council. Everyone turned to the door of the room to see a giant shadow standing there. It was the barbarian. "Release the girl, now," he ordered, his eyes scanning the villagers like those of an irritated lion, and all hands did as they were told. Vrena scowled in anger, and then spat on the floor. "Welcome, sir," said Reveus. "We have just gathered to make merry conversation." "The conversation doesn't sound too merry to me," growled the barbarian. "But you are right to have your grievances. You pay me well, and I have shown nothing for it yet." The barbarian took a swig of ale from his bottle. "It's time we got ready. Winter is coming soon, and Murgors look to take what they can before they crawl back into their pits. Fidoki told me that word has reached Iftherodor, that the Murgors have raided the neighboring village of Ifthar. They will be here soon." "So, what does His Eminence propose we do?" Begram mocked. "Tomorrow morning we will build defenses to protect the village. In the afternoon I will train you for war." The barbarian turned around to leave, but then stopped. He turned his head and said, "One more thing, dogs. If any of you decide you want to be brave like your little speeches, you will join the Sinner's Sons in whatever hell I have sent them. Is this understood?" Multiple villagers murmured aye as they shuffled uneasily. "Good," said the barbarian, and left the building. 4. Preparations. After 5 days of brutal labor, Efterodor had become a fortress. The surrounding tree line had been hacked down, the logs sharpened and driven into the earth to form a stout palisade. A second watchtower rose at the village gate, serving both as lookout and killing platform. With defense taking precedence, there was little time for training. The seasoned hunters practiced with bow and arrow, while the villagers' 3 crossbows were placed in the hands of the women, weapons that they could wield with less strain. Vrena was among them, steady-eyed and resolute, hastily trained to prevent the consequences she would suffer if she was captured by these monsters. The barbarian rode his horse around the village, observing the building of the defenses and ordering the peasants about. They were made to train with spears before dinner, and they had their axes as their secondary weapons, which they practiced with on the trees they tore down. At night, when the villagers had been worked to exhaustion, the barbarian retreated to the last drop-in, where he turned to drinking and wenching to finish off his day. By the 6th day, the watchtower and palisade were nearly complete, and the peasants had been worked to exhaustion, their hatred for their new master growing by the hour. It was then that 8 flagellants of the god Raifrock, led by a monk, came chanting into the village with cries of doom and lamentation. The villagers gathered to greet them, and the monks told of a Murgor band that had ambushed them on the road, leaving them the only survivors. The women, they warned, were taken for breeding, the men for food. The tale filled Efterodor with terror. "So they ate your companions?" asked the barbarian, making himself the voice of quivering Efterodor. "Aye, they are eating them now," the flagellants cried out, tearing at their dishevelled hair. "Good," said the barbarian. "In that case they will be well fed, and will give us more time to prepare until they get hungry again. Meanwhile, you holy men will stop your moanings and groanings and become useful. Help us finish the village defenses." "We are men dedicated to Raifrock, not to the shovel," the monk protested. Rage filling the warrior's eyes, he brandished his axe and said, "If you do not stop terrifying my men and get to work, I will make sure you are dedicated to him in the afterlife. Fidoki, fetch some shovels for these good men. They have come to serve Efterodor, to help prepare our defenses." "At once, master," the Kalkadjir said with a satisfied smirk on his face. And so, Efterodor's forces were fattened by 9 more men, who began their service by digging trenches around the village. It was on the 8th day, when the sun was sinking behind the western trees, that Fathas came huffing and puffing, running out of the forest, past the newly made tree stumps. "Mugors!" he cried out. "Murgors! They are here! They got Haifon!" A javelin came flying from the tree line, and perfectly planted itself between Fathas's shoulder blades. With a final gasp, Fathas collapsed to the earth, and never got up again. The villager that manned one of the guard towers blew his horn, and those that were working outside the palisades dropped their tools and ran to the gate, while those inside hurried into position to man their stations. The doors of the last drop-in burst open, and in hobbled Fidoke, with a look of worry on his face. "Master!" he cried out. "Master! The Murgors have arrived!" He found the barbarian in a giant tub, taking a playful bath with the two sly wenches. With a last gulp of sweet mead, he turned to the innkeeper and said, "Elmul, fetch your spear and 2 knives for the girls." The innkeeper nodded and quickly brought out 2 blades. The barbarian took them and offered them to the girls. "If anything comes through these doors that isn't human, I want you to stab each other in the heart. Am I clear?" The girls nodded and said, "Yes, master." "Good." The barbarian was drying his massive body with the provided skins. "Now go fetch my armor. I go to war." 5. The Battle of Eftherodor. The watchtower's occupants cursed as arrows thudded into the wood. Vrena and the crossbow girls huddled for cover in the tower. Derhio, the tower's original defender, lay motionless below, a fatal arrow silencing his commands as he plummeted from the structure. At the gate, Reveus' curses echoed through the chaos, as flaming arrows rained down, scorching the thatch and timbers. Still the barbarian offered no response. "Where in the 7 hells is that bastard savage?" thought Reveus as he braced himself to face whatever was coming out of the forest. The gate, of course, was no true gate yet. It stood open, without doors, allowing passage in and out at will. Sharpened stakes had been driven into the ground to choke the entrance, narrowing any assault into a killing funnel, while men with bows and spears stood ready, waiting for the attack they knew would come. A horn blew from the forest, and it was followed by savage cries in a savage tongue that sent shivers down Reveus's spine. The Murgors then emerged, and Reveus observed their apish frames, corded with muscle under their greyish skin, the monsters wearing minimal armor and some bearing shields and crude helms. Horrible tusks emerged from their maws before piggish noses, yelling their feral war cries as they raised their weapons to the sky. One of them was riding a beast with similar attributes to a horse, but it was not a horse. Its maw bore flesh-tearing fangs like a wolf as the creature enjoyed the taste of meat over grass. This towering, feral beast of knitted muscle and sharp hoof was known in the civilized world as a Tugak steed, but there was nothing civilized from whence it came. "Where in the 7 hells is the barbarian?" asked the spearman beside Reveus. For a moment Reveus thought that was his own voice, for he was thinking the same. The mounted Murgor, likely their leader, raised his axe in the air and cried out something in his foul tongue. Matching his savage cry, his warriors surged forward. Reveus watched, with spear and shield quivering in his hand, as thundering step by step, the Murgors charged towards the gap in the palisade that he and his fellows were defending. Missiles rained down from the watchtowers, a couple of them landing hits and wounding the Murgors. There were perhaps 2 scores of them, running wildly towards him and his companions who numbered around the same. The hunters on the surrounding rooftops and behind the stakes unleashed their volley into the mob of incoming monsters, taking 2 or 3 of them down. They quickly re-nocked their arrows and fired again. The monsters charged forward fearlessly, heedless of the deadly rain. With great howls they funneled through the palisade and fell upon the men. When they came, Reveus screamed, eyes clenched shut, as he thrust his spear blindly toward the onrushing shapes. He did not see the pitch before the gate flare into sudden life, kindled by a flaming arrow. The Murgors pouring through the narrow entrance were transformed into writhing silhouettes of fire. Some fell shrieking, rolling in the dirt as the flames devoured them. Others pressed on regardless, blazing and snarling, striking at their prey even as they burned. Arrows hissed ceaselessly into the mass, thudding into flesh, while the spearmen locked shields and braced themselves, absorbing the fury of the charge as fire, blood, and screams filled the gate of Therodor. Ravius opened his eyes to see a flaming figure running towards him, axe in hand. He stabbed with his spear, and his weapon found meat. The burning monster struck back, axe biting into Ravius's shield. Burning and impaled by a spear, the Murgor fell over to meet its dark gods. But before Ravius could recover and congratulate himself on his first kill, another Murgor took his comrade's place, and with mouth gaping open, the last thing Ravius saw was a bludgeon swinging towards his face. "Keep firing, you dogs! Don't lose heart now! Stand your ground!" The barbarian's voice brought courage to the men at the gate as they faced the onslaught of the savages. The hunters continued to shoot through the stakes, while the spearmen struggled to hold them at bay. From above, more missiles rained down on the monsters. The first line of Murgors had fallen, but through the fires more monsters emerged, and these joined the carnage with even more vigor and savagery. The barbarian shot arrow after arrow at the enemy warriors, his mighty arms drawing the bowstring with such power that the arrowhead penetrated flesh and bone, and came out on the other side of his victims. But alas, the spearmen could not hold against such an onslaught, and the barbarian ordered the retreat to the makeshift wall erected across the main boulevard. The second phase of the battle was about to commence. 6. The Chiefs Contend. The Murgors surged forward like a black tide, their guttural war cries drowning the screams of the dying. Flames licked hungrily at the thatched roofs and wooden beams from the buildings, sending plumes of acrid smoke skyward as the last archers plummeted from their perches, some impaled on waiting spears below, others crashing into the melee with blades drawn, selling their lives dearly in a desperate whirlwind of steel and fury. Verna watched as the Murgors funneled down the road and attacked the makeshift wall. "Reload and shoot!" she ordered her companions. One Murgor had tried to climb up the watchtower, but the girls threw rocks on him until one struck his skull, and he fell to the ground from where he stopped moving. "Fire!" cried out one of Verna's companions. Verna looked down, and she saw that indeed the Murgors had started an inferno under the tower. The other girl began to scream, and the surrounding Murgors looked up to observe the wailing female. To Verna's surprise, they began an attempt to put out the flames. "Reload!" Verna cried. "It's better to burn up here than to be captured by them." She shot down at one of the Murgors and landed a hit. "Fight, you dogs!" the barbarian roared. "Your families will all die if you do not hold these monsters back." He struck down at the Murgors from his horse with his massive axe, cleaving any that clambered over the makeshift wall. He cursed savagely as the Murgors set the barricade alight, and flames began to devour it. Arrows still rained from the skies, and now women, children, and the elderly joined the fight, hurling debris down from the rooftops. "Fight on, men!" the barbarian bellowed. "Fight and die!" At that moment, the Tugak steed gathered its powerful legs and vaulted the blazing wall in a single, thunderous leap. It crashed down among the spearmen, its fangs snapping and hoofs lashing, smashing men to the ground as it tore and trampled. From its back, the savage rider struck without mercy, his spear flashing as it stabbed and thrust, turning the landing into a slaughter amid fire, screams, and splintered bone. Kicking his heels into his beast, the barbarian sent his mount surging forward towards the enemy rider. With a mighty swing of his axe, he planted his steel into the Tugak's skull. Its rider tumbled off his dying mount, but was instantly on his feet, ready to attack. Having lost his spear, he leapt into the air and tackled the barbarian off his beast. The three of them, Murgor, man, and horse, tumbled over into the dirt. The surrounding men began spearing the Murgor chief as he wrestled with their leader, forcing him to turn his attention to them. With a menacing howl, he let go of the barbarian and turned to face one of his would-be killers. Wrenching a spear out of his own pierced thigh, the Murgor chief struck the man with the butt of the spear's shaft. He then skewered his other attacker, and then howled in pain as another spear point entered his body. "Come on then, beast," said the barbarian in a grim voice. "Let me relieve you of your pain, and send you to your blood gods." The barbarian pivoted out of the way as the Murgor chieftain launched himself forward with a deafening roar. The Murgor's spear sliced through the air and struck against the barbarian's chain-mail shirt, rings exploding beneath the impact, torn asunder by the savage blow. Meat split and blood shed from the barbarian's mighty breast. Only his quick reflexes saved him from the full strength of the attack, the spear only scratching his flesh. In response, the barbarian struck at the monster's hand with his axe, the blade biting into the brute's wrist. The Murgor dropped the spear along with his gripping hand and opened his savage mouth, screaming an unhallowed sound at the barbarian. With another swipe of his axe, the barbarian removed the head from the monster's shoulders, putting an end to its primordial howls. 7. The battle goes on. The battle continued. Murgors climbed the houses to butcher those on top, who in turn fought with rock, bow, axe, and dagger. Verna continued to shoot at the Murgors until she had one bolt left. The monsters had somehow managed to put out the fire that was burning the watchtower. The treasure that huddled on top was too precious to be left to destruction. A Murgor then began climbing the tower, Verna's companions having run out of bolts. Verna looked down at the beast. His face was ugly and misshapen, two tusks protruding from his bottom lip, pointy ears sticking back from his head, and hungry, determined eyes. Under his tusks he bit on a dagger as he climbed up the ladder, his giant hands pulling him up, step by step. "God save us!" Verna cried, fumbling to reload her crossbow, as the other two girls huddled together in terror. The Murgor hauled himself onto the platform and loomed over them, tusked face split by a hideous grin. He seized Vrena by the throat and lifted her from the planks as though she weighed nothing. The other girls screamed as Vrena clawed helplessly, choking beneath his grip. The brute ogled her with ravenous delight, tearing at her clothes. Then, suddenly, his leer faltered, his fingers slackened. Vrena dropped gasping to the boards as the Murgor toppled forward beside her, a battle-axe buried deep in the back of his skull. "He was in my way," complained the Barbarian as he appeared from behind his victim. He pushed the body of the Murgor off of the platform to land with a wet splat on the ground below. He then turned to the village, lifted an object he held in his hands to the rising moon, and cried at the top of his lungs, "Look here, you spawns of hell! Look here and gaze at your chieftain's dead head." He tossed the head at the Murgors below, so that they could take a closer look. "This is the fate of those that face me." He then raised his blood-drenched axe to the sky, and the villagers below cheered. Leaderless, the Murgors fell back in confusion. Their retreat turned into a full rout as men shot missiles at them and chased them with their spears, running this way and that through the village, trying to find an escape. They were hunted down one by one and massacred. Some managed to escape through the flaming gate and disappeared into the forest. "They run?" Verna grudgingly asked her former violator. "Aye, they run. I have fought these monsters plenty of times. Their chieftain is their priest. They believe him blessed by their blood gods. As long as he leads, they are fearless. Once he falls, they believe their blood gods have cursed their venture, and they flee." The Barbarian then took his axe and made his way down the ladder to the corpse-strewn ground. The village was ablaze with chaos, its defenders battered and weary as they scrambled to contain the inferno. Men rushed wildly, buckets sloshing, as they battled to quench the flames devouring their homes. The Barbarian decided it was a good time to visit the last drop inn. Limping past the chaos and the fires, he craved a foaming jug of ale and the caressing hands of the two wenches that would bind his many wounds. His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps running behind him. He turned to see Begram, poised to strike with an axe raised above his head. With no time to turn or flee, the Barbarian braced himself for the blow that would send him at last to the halls of his god. But the stroke never fell. Begram stiffened mid-stride, as though some unseen hand had seized his soul. He dropped first to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face, a bolt jutting from his spine. From the darkness behind him stepped Vrena, crossbow in hand. "I meant to shoot you," said she, the anger returning to her eyes after saving the man who violated her from his would-be killer. "You are still scum," she continued, "nothing but a savage, barely any different than the monsters that attacked us tonight." "I know," said the Barbarian, observing the girl with the crossbow. He looked down at his would-be killer as a pool of blood began to spread around his torso. He grunted in disgust. Turning back to Verna, he said, "You need more practice, wench," and then turned and continued his walk to the inn. 8. You know my name. The next day, Fidoki found the Barbarian riding out of the settlement. The exhausted villagers had dragged the Murgor corpses into a big pile outside the village, and were about to light them on fire. The smell of their burning flesh would be terrible to behold, but so was the smell of their rotting corpses. The bodies of their fallen companions had been gathered inside and were prepared for a funeral ritual. The Barbarian rode out of the gates with his body bandaged, his stomach full and his purse fuller. he could stay and live like the king of this wretched village. But he knew its inhabitants would be sharpening their daggers if he remained. More importantly, he was restless, and he knew he would get bored. Fidoki approached him. "Master," the Kalkadjer said as he wobbled over, "I never got your name." "You know my name," said the giant man. "What is it?" the Kalkadjer asked, confused. "It's Barbarian," said the barbarian. He kicked his heels into the flanks of his steed, riding past the grave marker, with the dagger holding a lock of hair. And, like a phantom, he was gone.